Chapter 12.
Ba chìm bảy nồi.
Vietnamese. A life filled with trials and tribulations, the ebb and flow of the tide of life. Literally, 3 sinks, 7 floats. Maki was not panicked, because she could not panic. It was physically impossible for her to feel anxiety, worry, qualms, or fears. So when she thought about how she had felt when Dazai-san had looked at her like she was the first flower he'd ever seen bloom for him and him alone, when she thought about how she had been so nervous and so hopeful it rearranged parts of her, she did not do anything silly like wring her hands or bite her lips or mutter to herself. She just sat very still, in private, and considered the facts of the matter. Dazai-san had been in considerable pain, and was probably still drunk. She had caught him off guard when she'd touched him that gently, as she wasn't one to caress, and he wasn't one to indulge. His surprise was understandable. He had been fairly out of sorts. It was her reaction to his that was remarkable. Her body and her mind had responded to his surprise with some sort of giddy, optimistic fear. Like she'd found herself caught in a spring whirlwind, she had spun and emerged in a strange place where everything was the same, but at a slant. Why had her body responded that way to him? Immediately afterwards, she had resolved not to dig. Maybe she didn't have the experience of these emotions, but she had hundreds of lifetimes within her, and she could go through them and find similar instances and determine why they had felt that way in that moment, and then figure out her own situation. It was very possible. She did it frequently to understand why the people around her operated in the ways they did. But in this instance, her logic was pointing out that it would be unwise for her to do so. Why? Because emotion, like memory, was a river whose flow was endless. If she thrust herself into it recklessly, she would surely drown. So he made her feel a certain new way. So it was a risk. She wouldn't let it stop her from staying with him. He nullified her ability and let her be a regular person, and he was her ticket to freedom. Damn everything else about him. These were the only things that mattered. She'd just work more. She'd cook more. She'd play the piano more. She'd do the things she wanted, find other ways to feel, and make sure that he wasn't such a disproportionate part of her life. Resolved, she exited the bathroom and went back to the bedroom to get dressed. Oda-san was sitting on the couch taking his time with his coffee, and Dazai-san was slowly buttoning his white shirt. "Can I have more work?" she asked. "You want to help me?" "If that's what you want me to do. I just feel like I'm not busy enough." I have a job for you. Some certain explosives to be planted in a certain motorbike." "No, thank you. Something else, please." "I don't like underlings who don't listen. Let me see what I can find." "Thanks," she said. "Do you want to do stuff like Odasaku?" She cocked her head. "I don't know what he does." His fingers stilled on his buttons, and he asked, "What did you two talk about last night, then?" "We were getting to know each other. I told him about me, he told me about himself. He seems really nice." Dazai-san had a strange look on his face that she couldn't parse. It wasn't quite anger, like how he had looked when he'd found Maki and Chuya-san drunk at the piano, and it wasn't quite fear. She had never seen him wear such an emotion, and she didn't believe she was capable of eliciting it in him. And yet he stared at her like she had just told him the only thing that awaited him was the cold and dark. Then he blinked and broke the spell binding him to that moment. He focused on his shirt and said lightly, "Yeah, Odasaku's a gem." There were things she could have said to see how he reacted. She could ask why he'd never mentioned her to his friend. She could ask if he'd invite her to drinks with them sometime. She could ask why he seemed so alarmed that he had let the two of them meet last night. But he didn't like questions. Her silence was telling to him. He probably knew that there were things on her mind that she didn't dare voice to him. But speaking of them would make them real, and he didn't want that, so they put on their clothes in quiet. When he was dressed, he went into the living room and struck up a jovial conversation with Oda-san, who was as calm and measured with him as he had been with her last night. "Maki Maki, we're taking off," Dazai-san called. "Check your phone for some fun new jobs later." Still zipping up the back of her dress, she poked just her head out the door and waved at the two of them. "Bye! Oda-san, come visit again." "Thanks for the hospitality," he said, nodding to her. Dazai-san waved at her, and the two of them slipped on their shoes and left. What an interesting start to the day. It seemed that life was picking back up after recovering from the Kellys debacle. Humming, she finished putting on her dress and let herself have breakfast now that Dazai-san wasn't around with his sensitive stomach. She had given Oda-san one of the 2 onigiri, and she ate the other one. As she did so, she looked around the apartment, making a little plan for cleaning. She bustled here and there, putting Oda-san's blanket and pillowcase in the wash, doing the dishes from the tea last night, putting their first aid kit back under the sink, and a few other minor tasks. When she was done, she checked her phone. An order had come in, though she had no way of knowing whether it was something Dazai-san had chosen for her. Not that that was very important. She was just thankful to have something to do. Today, she was on something of a tight schedule by the looks of it. Normally, she only had 1 or maybe 2 tasks a day, but she had 3, one right after another. Dazai-san must have had a hand in this. She'd have to thank him tonight whenever they both got home. Eager, she tucked her phone in her pockets with her gloves and weapons and went downstairs where the Port Mafia car was waiting for her. Behind her car were 2 others filled with the 6 men in charge of recording her movements. It had been a little since she'd had her little entourage, and a part of her did wish that she could operate freely. The bigger part of her realized that as long as her memory was faulty, though, the organization wouldn't leave her on her own. It was best for everyone. The first of 3 jobs was simple. All she had to do was slip into Chinatown and put a little pressure on a business owner who wasn't paying his protection money. Being intimidating and putting on a mean face didn't come naturally to her because of her ability, but it wasn't difficult to assume an angry little personality and hit someone a few times with one of her rods. She had plenty of examples of that in her memories, and imitation was an easy game. She shook him down until the money came fluttering out of his wallet, and then she moved on to the next thing, with the cash in her pocket. The bell on the door chimed brightly when she pushed against it, wiping a little blood from her cheek. She entered onto the busy market street, where many people were walking to and fro, inspecting the wares, going in and out of shops. It was a boisterous, exuberant place, and Maki couldn't decide whether she liked thoroughfares like this or quiet alleys better. Both had their own charm. Her men followed after her. They stood out in their suits and dark sunglasses, and, once more, she wished that she could lose them for little jobs like this. She wouldn't forget roughing up a nobody. There was nothing bad about it. And this next job, overseeing a delivery on the docks, would be just as humdrum. Have them come with her when she had to go kill someone, because sometimes that could go sideways, and she technically didn't have a skill made for combat. But surely it was overkill to have them with her for these chores. And she could feel their eyes on her. It went without saying that they were watching her. That was why Dazai-san had stuck them to her. But sometimes, like now, she could feel them like hands on her, and it wasn't her favorite sensation. Especially when they were new, like this batch that had only worked with her 1 day before the stuff with the Kellys happened. They had no idea who she was. All they knew was that she was an ability user and an executive's plaything. Well, Maki assumed that was what they thought of her. It was an open secret that she was dating Dazai-san at this point, and even if they were professional when they interacted in public, the word still spread. She wasn't particularly strong or beautiful, and she didn't have any seniority. Despite that, she was still assigned a detail of bodyguards. It reeked of favoritism. Eventually, the men would start to like her. Most people did if they were around her long enough. Back in the facility, they had cycled through handlers regularly to keep anyone from forming an attachment. Probably. Those memories were very patchy, and she didn't enjoy looking back on them, so she didn't. Maki got into a car, her men followed, and they proceeded to the next job. The driver brought her to a desolate, run-down dock in a very seedy part of Yokohama Bay, where everything was more rust than metal, and brown weeds rustled feebly in the chilly breeze. It wasn't the most hospitable place she'd ever been to. Still, a job was a job, and things like the cold or desolation meant very little to her. She got out of the car, and with her 6 men behind her, walked through the large open door of the warehouse in question. Maki blinked. She was on the ground, one cheek pressed into the gritty, rough cement. There was a net made of thick, heavy steel cables over her, and it was so dense that it crushed her lungs. She struggled to take a full breath. Her body and clothes were wet with blood. The wind hit her in strange places, like her dress was ripped. She couldn't tell if she was injured because she couldn't feel any pain, and she couldn't look down to inspect her body. Nothing stirred. Maki couldn't turn her head, but there was a prone man a couple yards away, missing everything above the neck. She didn't know what had happened, but she knew what she had to do. With great effort, because of the net bearing her down, she reached into her pocket and retrieved her phone. She couldn't bring it up to her ear, and she couldn't look at it, but from memory she unlocked it and placed a call. It rang quietly. "Maki Maki?" Dazai-san said in his usual sing-song. "Dazai-san," she said, voice even but faint. "Everyone's dead and I don't know how." She could practically feel the shift. He said, "I'll be there in a few minutes. Are you safe?" "I don't know. Maybe there's more coming." "All right. Protect yourself." She wasn't sure how to do that when she couldn't move, but she said, "Okay," and ended the call. Would other people come to get her before Dazai-san made it? She was helpless under this net unless they were stupid enough to touch her skin and let her use her ability on them. She wished that she were stronger so she could throw it off her and at least take shelter behind a crate or something. In the very center of the open floor of the warehouse as she couldn't be in a more vulnerable position. A car came to a stop outside. The tires crunched on the loose bits of old cement, and the brakes whined very softly. A door opened and then closed. Footsteps, grave and purposeful, approached her. "Wow! This is really something." Dazai-san had made it here first. He seemed to have come alone. Unhurriedly, he walked around the warehouse, took in its sights, and then knelt down in front of her face. His expression was terribly amused. "We've got some investigating to do," he said. "Can you get this off me? It's hard to breathe," she said. "Oh, right," he said, as though only now noticing. He gripped the net and groaned as he heaved it off her. The first thing she did was take a lungful of air, and then she pushed herself into a sitting position. Dazai-san was crouched beside her, taking her in clinically. "Your foot is smashed," he noted. So it was. It looked like her right foot had been struck by a wrecking ball. The bones were mashed and poking out, her toes were bent, and blood oozed out of the many contusions. A lengthy surgery would be required. "I guess they really wanted me immobile," she said. "The net was overkill," he said. "Stay sitting and tell me what you remember." She shook her head. "I walked in here, and then I was under the net, and everyone else was dead." "Your ability obliterated this entire thing? Interesting. Well, let's start with what we can tell just by looking. Your 6 men were picked off almost instantly, judging by where their bodies are. They hardly stepped inside before they got a bullet between the eyes. The enemy knew you'd be coming here, and that you'd have them with you, and they planned accordingly. There's nothing remarkable about that, though. Now, as for the enemy... Maki Maki, have you been holding out on me?" She stared at him. He smiled and waved his hand, gesturing to the bodies. "None of the men with you had abilities, so they couldn't have done this. That leaves you. Why wouldn't you tell me that your ability can be so gruesome? Did you think it'd give me an upset stomach?" She cast around the warehouse and identified 8 bodies that were not Port Mafia men. They weren't in suits. They wore outfits that reminded her of spies in movies. All black, trim outfits that didn't leave a single inch of skin exposed. The only part of their bodies that she could see was the pink and red insides of their necks, and the bits of skull, brain, and hair that were scattered all over the warehouse like moist confetti. "You told me," Dazai-san hummed, "that if you sped up your ability any further, it would make their heads pop. And I know that you don't lie. Were you speaking from experience instead of hypotheticals, then?" "I have no memory of using my ability like that." So you don't deny that it's a possibility?" "I mean, I've tried to go faster than 3 seconds, but I've never been able to. It would benefit me if I could, so I'd like to, even if it's messy. But I have no proof that I can." "This is probably proof enough, but let's see. Go into your little mind palace and tell me if you have any memories from these men." She accessed her store of stolen lives, went to the most recently acquired. The man was one of the 8 attackers, and at lightning speed she went through his life in its entirety. Then she went to the next one she had taken, expecting another of these 8. She was surprised when she was met with the memories of one of the counterfeit jewel runners from Chiba that Chuya-san had picked. "I was only able to get one of them," she said. For the first time since arriving here, Dazai-san looked taken aback. "Did you forget the others' memories as well?" "That's not possible. I've built understandings of things I've forgotten through the memories I stole during those times. If I used it, I should have everything, without exception." "Well, share what you do have." "He was Japanese, a mercenary type. He didn't know any of the other guys until they met to do this job today. He was told that the job was to capture a deadly ability user who could zombify any person she touched, alive or dead. He had instructions to get me tangled up in this net and carry me to a drop-off point outside of Yokohama. In the event that it looked like I was going to touch someone, they were to detonate themselves to keep their autonomy in death." Dazai-san took in her words and tinkered with them. So they're not absolute amateurs. Maybe it really is a government that's after you, though I have a hard time imagining any government body is organized enough for this. They're so obsessed with the red tape that they fail to see what's right in front of them most of the time. Then again, I can't claim to be an expert in what someone outside of Japan is doing. What information do you have on the person who hired them?" She shook her head. "They contacted him via the dark web. They communicated with video, but their faces were obscured, and their voices fed through a mixer. I can't tell anything about their accent or gender. Anything. The room they were in was just plain white, with absolutely nothing in it. It could have been anywhere in the world." "Faces? So there's more than one. Go over it again. Slowly. Check for absolutely anything distinguishing. No detail is too small." She reviewed the memories. Maki blinked. "I see," he said suddenly. "A man and woman, likely European. And the brand of the woman's shirt was Uniqlo. I wonder how intentional that was, picking one that's Japanese." "But I didn't tell you yet," she said. Dazai-san stared at her for a moment, and an understanding passed through his brown eyes. Quietly, he said, "Your old keepers must have trained you well." She tried to run her fingers through her hair, but they snagged in the blood and detritus. "Did I forget?" "Yeah. You told me everything about the meeting, in painstaking detail. I could illustrate it if I felt like it. You can access the memories, view them freely, but talking about them or drawing pictures of certain people forces you to forget that you've brought them into the real world. What a peculiar contradiction. The people in this video, you recognize them even if you can't see or hear them fully. They must have been very important to you in all the worst ways." "I don't feel well," she said. "How?" "There's pressure building in my head," she said. "Well, you've done about all you can. Does it feel serious, or can you wait an hour or so?" "It's fine." "Good." He rose to his feet. You just make yourself comfortable while I look around a little more." So she did, and watched as he knelt down to examine the dead men, their clothes, their shoes. His expression was empty, his movements methodical, and he did not make any comments as he worked. If he made any discoveries, he kept them secret. Meanwhile, Maki wondered what everything meant. It was unfortunate that she had forgotten something so important, and that she had only been able to get the memories of one of them. Maybe some of the others had more information. Her joints were only a little uncomfortable, which meant that she had used her speed very briefly. Had she hesitated? Had something kept her from going all out to eliminate them? The man she had touched was the first to die, so the time between his death and her awakening was a big hole she could never mend. No one could ever understand just how inconvenient it was to have the ability to remember a stranger's life in its entirety, but be missing minutes, hours, days, weeks, and months worth of your own. How much it made her question herself, compulsively review her own memories, and hunt for the gaps. "Give me your phone," Dazai-san said. He was done being a detective, and he had knelt down beside her once again. She put it in his hand. Then he slipped it into the pocket of his jacket. "They must have bugged it at some point, but you wouldn't know when that was, would you?" Maki sighed. "I have no idea." "You make things fun, Maki-Maki," he said. "You're not upset with me?" she said, unable to hide her surprise. He smiled. "Why would I be? You got me out of a boring task, and you gave me an interesting new puzzle." "But I forgot all of the important things." "Not all the important things. And anyways, you don't forget because you're an idiot or inattentive. You'd remember if you could." He was kind at the most unexpected times, when she least deserved it. He really made no sense. However, she was glad that he was here to help her piece together everything that she forgot. She gave him a smile. His expression turned troubled. "There is the matter of how I'm going to get you out of here without crying." "It's fine," she said. "The car isn't far, right?" He sighed. "I guess it's not." "I promise not to get tears on your shirt." "Who said I was talking about you? I've been stabbed, and now I have to carry another person somewhere. I'm delicate." She laughed. "Well, help me to my feet, and I can just lean on you. You don't have to carry me." "What do you think is best? Carrying you and letting you feel everything, or hobbling and making your injuries worse?" "Neither is optimal. Whichever you want." Dazai-san looked her up and down, as though he could see through to her bones and assess her damage fully. Then he leaned forward to scoop her up. His right arm went around her back, his fingers slotted into the grooves of her ribs over her dress. His left arm curved under her bent knees, and his hand found the ball of her knee. Instantly, the world melted and streamed like wax in blistering flames. Maki cried out in fright, her body locked up, and she gripped the shoulder of his jacket so fiercely she could have ripped it. They had nearly gotten her. If they had sent any backup, and if that backup had arrived before Dazai-san, they would have thrown her in the back of a car and whisked her away, back to the place where there was no night or day, only jobs and experiments and misery. "Maki-Maki," Dazai-san said. "I can't go back," she hissed, tears streaming down her face and onto his shirt. "If they catch me, I'll bite off my own tongue and choke on it." "We're doing what we can to prevent that." "They won't stop. They won't ever stop. You're wasting your efforts. Find someone else to work with you. I'm going to be gone in a few months." "What makes you say that?" he asked calmly. "They couldn't find me when I kept moving through Asia. There were close calls, but I always managed to slip away. I can't stay still. I need to go." "Take a deep breath and calm down," he said. "What will panicking do you?" "I'm not—" "You are panicking, and it's unsightly. Rein yourself in." She forced air into her lungs and then pushed it out. Her body was trembling, and even her thoughts felt wobbly. She still had a death grip on his shoulder, and she realized that she had pressed herself against him. It must hurt his injury to have her squeezing him like that. But she wanted someone's warmth right now. She wanted someone, anyone, to hold back fate. I'm sorry that you picked me. I can't give you what you want. His expression was cool, and so was his tone. It's too soon to decide that, and you're not the one who has the final say anyways. Dazai-san was her new handler. But would he turn out to be better or worse than her old ones? Would he use her just as ruthlessly? It seemed that no matter where she went, her ability attracted the very worst people. If she could con a god into lending her an ear, she would have it take away her powers and make her a pitifully normal human with nothing to her name. She'd beg for scraps and sleep on cement and be happy, because she'd know that no one would try to wring the joy out of her again. No one would put her in cages and force her to bend into the shapes they desired. Was he going to twist her into a new design and throw her away when he was bored? Or would he keep her by his side until they had reached the end of their promise and force her to take his life? Either way, she would be free of him at one point. And then what? What terrible things awaited her beyond that? She didn't want this life. Always running, always looking over her shoulder, always knowing that whatever she had was fleeting. It was fucking exhausting, and she was so tired she couldn't stand. How had she made it this far? Her ability made her an imbecile, she was certain, because only an idiot would keep herself alive when she was met with cruelty at every turn. Dazai-san had risen to his feet, clutching her to him. He carried her out of the warehouse and toward the waiting car. Every step echoed through her body, made her broken foot throb, along with the other bones and muscles she had somehow damaged. I was wondering what was really in your heart, he said presently. She stared up at him, bewildered. You don't lie, even when you're completely free. He had touched her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to see how she would react to this situation with all of her emotions. She was disgusted by how selfish he was, by how he treated her like all the others before him had. If she had been able to stand, she would have shoved out of his hold and walked away from him, no matter how nasty he became when she disobeyed him. Instead, she clenched her teeth and let him stow her in the back seat of the car. I told you before that I don't like experiments, she said. So you did, he hummed. He backed away from her, and when he did, he took his hands off her. Her world was bathed in vermilion once again, and she understood that she had been very upset, but that was all dead and decaying. At the forefront of her mind was joy that she could no longer feel her foot, and that Dazai-san had shown up in the first place. Otherwise, she would still be trapped under that net. He gave instructions to the driver, who took off silently. Then he took out her phone and started sending someone a message on it. She was curious what he was doing, but leaning over would have aggravated her wounds, so she stayed put. How long do you think surgery will be? He asked. How long do you think your surgery will be? He asked. She looked down at her foot. 7, 8 hours? Lots of bones to put back in place. He tapped out another message on her phone and then muttered, He's so predictable. She waited for an explanation, but he didn't give her one. They headed west, closer to the center of the city, and then to the Port Mafia headquarters. She couldn't go through the front doors, as clearly battered as she was, so the driver pulled around to a lesser-known entrance that was underground in a dark parking garage. People were there with a wheelchair. Don't wait up, Dazai-san said lightly. Thanks for coming to get me, she said. The 3 orderlies opened the door and put her in the wheelchair. Before they had even turned her around, the car was pulling away. It would have been nice if he had stayed with her, but it would have been a pointless gesture. She was going to be operated on for hours, and he was an executive. Her misadventure had already made him lose a good hour of his day, and he would probably spend a little more time thinking about who was behind it. His time was very precious, and she was not. The Port Mafia Hospital was the best underground medical institution she'd ever had the pleasure of visiting, and from the memories she'd gleaned of others, she could say with confidence that it was one of the greatest in the world. Normally, even with bigger organizations, you'd be ushered into a cramped, dingy room with flickering fluorescents and treated by a man whose license had been revoked a decade prior. Medicines would be expired, and the sanitation was always in question. As a criminal, getting injured was often a death sentence. Either the wound or the treatment could kill you. But the Port Mafia was different. She was wheeled into a triage room first, where men and women in scrubs assessed her entire body to check for injuries other than her foot, and then put her through a CT machine. Once they were done with that, she was given an IV of fluids, enough anesthesia that she blacked out, and they began operating on her in a proper theater. When she came to, she was in a firm bed, wearing a thin gray samue and comfortable pants that matched. A blanket hid everything below her waist, and the top half of the bed had been tilted up so she was halfway upright. An IV was still hooked up to her left arm, and she wished they hadn't done that. "How are you feeling?" To her right, Chuya-san sat on the edge of a foldable chair. He was staring at her like she was a kitten that had managed to cross the expressway. A smile bloomed across her lips. Absolutely wonderful. "Don't bullshit me. Your foot was broken in 17 places." "I don't feel it. What are you doing here?" "You texted me. You said you were on the way to the hospital and you wanted to know if I'd take you home afterwards. Don't you remember?" "Oh, my memory's a little patchy today." "What happened?" She ran a hand through her long hair. "I got jumped." "By who?" "I don't know. I didn't really take the time to get to know them." "Well, did you use your ability on them? Learn any clues?" "I managed to get one of them, but I didn't learn much. But they're not out to hurt the Port Mafia or Dazai-san or anything like that. It's just me they want." He frowned. "What, is that supposed to reassure me?" "I mean, at least it's not some big conspiracy. No one else is in any danger." He opened his mouth to, by the stormy expression on his face, berate her. However, he was cut off when a doctor in a clean white coat parted the curtains around her bed and came in. He plucked her chart off the footboard of the bed, peeled back the blanket to study her leg and foot, and made a pronouncement. "You have permission to leave, but you need to stay off the foot for 2 weeks at least. Take a steady stream of painkillers and antibiotics as prescribed. Don't skimp on them or try to save them for the next time. Get plenty of rest, food, and fluids." "Thanks," she said warmly, and plucked the IV out of her arm. The doctor's brows shot high, and Chuya-san stood up, but Maki was already spinning and throwing her legs over the side of the bed. Her right foot was bound in a very thick cast midway up the calf. She looked over at Chuya-san as she put her arm out. "Well, give me a hand." "You're out of your mind," he muttered, hurrying to her. "Don't let go of me." He grabbed her hand and made sure her arm was firmly over his shoulders. Then he used his ability to make her light and put his other hand on her waist. "Don't put that foot on the ground," he said. "Roger Dodger," she said. He walked her out of the hospital, moving slowly to accommodate her. Because he was gripping one of her hands with his, her ability was seeping into him and made him much quieter and tamer than usual. Maki wished that her ability was like his, so she could decide when to use it. It wasn't fair to the people around her that she was constantly smothering half of them. After picking up the prescriptions at the little dispensary within the facility, they headed to the parking garage. It seemed that he was without the motorcycle today. A black Port Mafia car took them to her apartment, and once again he made her lighter. The only thing she had on her was her house key. Dazai-san had taken her phone, and it seemed that everything else in her pockets was lost. She couldn't remember what had happened to them. They had probably disposed of the dress, as it was blood-soaked and ripped. "It was nice of them to wash me down," she commented. "Were you dirty?" he asked. "Drenched," she said. She unlocked the door and swung it open for them. "Thanks for getting me back here." "Nothing to thank me over," he said, slipping his shoes off. Once she had her one hospital slipper off, he helped her into the living room and onto the sofa. She sat with her legs stretched out on the cushions, and he stood over her, arms crossed. Now that he wasn't touching her, he was back to normal. "You're not giving me the full story." She stared up at him. "Well, I don't have the full story. My memory is patchy." "Why isn't Dazai here doing this?" "Because he's Dazai-san," she said. Chuya-san growled and clicked his tongue. "I thought you were a nobody from Hiroshima. Who's coming after you? What for? Are they going to come back?" "Could you please order something for dinner? I don't have my phone anymore." "Maki, quit acting like this isn't a big deal." She raised her hands plaintively. Okay. I'm not from Hiroshima originally. I'm from Europe. And there's people there that used to own me. They want me and my ability back. Maybe because they want to use me again, or maybe because I have secrets that are important to them. They'll try again for sure. They don't give up. Chuya-san looked taken aback by this information. It shouldn't come as too big of a surprise that she wasn't from Japan. She had a mixture of Japanese and Caucasian features. The rest of it was probably unexpected to him. He may have seen her ability once, but he still thought it was a lesser ability. As used to violence and brute force as he was, he likely didn't see its full merits. She could sneak into a prime minister's house and learn every state secret that he knew with absolute clarity. And she would never forget a single facet. And she had paid visits to prime ministers, generals, all manner of powerful people. She was a repository of war crimes and conspiracies. She had knowledge that could topple entire regimes if given to the right people at the right time. Of course, she had no interest in such plots, but to many people her very existence was a threat. Chuya-san blinked. "So, what's the plan?" "Dazai-san and the boss are thinking of something," she said. "But they made it clear to me that if the enemy is a government, they're going to hand me over." He bristled. "The boss I get, but why would Dazai just give you up?" She smiled. "I'm just a nice little diversion for him. If I become more trouble than I'm worth, he'll wash his hands of me." "I thought you liked him! Why are you so chill about that?" "Don't get me wrong, I'd like him to fight for me. He's a genius, and he's cutthroat enough that there's nothing he won't do. Anyone would want him on their side, if only because the alternatives are too scary. But he's logical. He won't risk himself for me or anyone else, and nothing I do will change that. If he wants to give me back to them all wrapped up, then he will. After that, it'll be up to me to get away from them again and start over somewhere new. Or hang myself." "You wouldn't," he said lowly. "Chuya-san, do you know what it's like to only see the sunlight when you're sent out to kill someone? Or how greedy people can get when your touch makes them forget every bad thing? Or how it feels to be treated like you're not even human, you're just some experiment? I told you before, I don't want to be put back in a cage. If I see the walls closing in, I will bite my legs off and crawl out. I got away from people twice. If they catch me again, they'll make sure I'm trapped for good, and I'm not going to let them have me." Chuya-san's expression softened, and sympathy filled his blue eyes. Something she had said resonated deeply within him. He got down on his knees in front of her, and put a strong hand on her shoulder. "I don't know what the fuck Dazai's planning, but they're not going to lay a hand on you. I swear it." She didn't deserve him. She was going to drag him down with her. She was certain.